I recently heard a Sunday sermon by my friend Rice Brooks from Philippians chapter 1, verse 3, in this phrase in the NIV, fellowship in the gospel. And that sermon sparked an interest in me about the rest of chapter 1. Rice's message was powerful, a rich explanation of the gospel, how it changes us and how it was center. And as Rice would say, it was the headlines of everything that Paul preached and everything that Paul wrote and how Paul lived. And I wanted to go take that headline and follow what Paul said about the gospel in the rest of his letter. And one way that I know I'm hearing a really good sermon is when I'm still thinking about it, and then when I get home, I go back to that text and study it for myself. And that's what happened with Rice's sermon. And I hope for you preachers, I hope that you preach in a way that makes people want to go read that text, and it provokes people to go deeper in the Word and apply it in their own context, in their own lives, and wrestle with that message and that text beyond the 30 minutes or 45 minutes or however long that sermon is. And that's what Rice's sermon did for me. And I want to talk about today to leaders and apply it to leaders. And so here's Rice's text, Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And most translations use that word partnership in the gospel. Rice was preaching from the NIV, which said fellowship in the gospel. It's the same word as koinonia, that Greek word that is much more than just a casual relationship or a casual conversation or people that we sort of run into at church and greet them in the church lobby occasionally. It's something much deeper about maybe the modern phrase about doing life together. So it's way beyond the surface, and Rice did a great job of unpacking that. But I was prompted to read the rest, and what I found was there were 5 other descriptions and mentions of the gospel in chapter 1, and then he doesn't mention it again until the end of the book, the very end of Philippians. The Apostle Paul ends the book by speaking about it's like going back to the beginning and summarizing what he said about the gospel. But here they are. What Paul said about the gospel, the first one is this message right here in verse 4 about partnership in the gospel. And just to think through what partnership is, I think about my son's business. My sons, and they have a third partner. So my sons, James and Jonathan and Mark, and they're the partners. They founded the business. They're the owners, but they're also people who are guests in their business or clients. They're guests. They're also vendors. There's a landlord where they rent buildings from. There are lawyers that they hire to do certain things. There are accountants they hire. There are various other people, but they're different than the partners. The partners are the owners. If something goes wrong, the partners have to fix it. If something goes wrong legally, the partners are in trouble. They're together. Whereas the others, all of these others, the lawyers, the customers, the clients, the vendors, all of these people have a transactional relationship. They're not partners. And so as long as they're doing what they're supposed to do and they're getting paid well for it, or they're getting good value for what's happening, they're in. If something goes wrong, they're out. The partners are stuck together. And I think we this idea of partnership in the gospel, that's what God's called us to build. It's what God's called us to do. It's more of that idea that Paul uses often about family and using family terms to talk about what the church community is. This time he uses the idea of partnership in the gospel. Well, it's not transactional. It's not what's good for me and am I getting a good value out of what I do as far as giving and time and all of this in this church context. No, we're partners, which means we're not just clients. We're not on the peripheral. We're not just seeing what's best for me. So the first one is partnership. And then he goes down and speaks of the gospel again in verse 7. And he's talking about being in prison while he's writing this letter. And it wasn't the only time, the first time or the last time he was in prison, but he's talking about being in prison and all that he's experienced. And he says he does it in defense and confirmation of the gospel. And often when we see the phrase confirmation of the gospel, I remember in Hebrews 2:4, it talks about that God confirmed the message preached with signs and wonders. And so often the confirmation of the gospel is supernatural. The confirmation of the gospel is something that only God can do. We can preach the gospel, we can explain it, we can teach it, but yet God comes in and confirms it, and often with signs and wonders and supernatural. And so Paul speaks about the partnership in the gospel, the confirmation of the gospel, which is often something that God and only God can do. Then he goes down in verse 12 and speaks about all of his adverse circumstances, being in prison and the injustice of it, and by being in prison, everything that he had planned to do was now on hold, or it was never going to happen. Here he is. All this, he says, worked to serve to the advance of the gospel. And so this gospel that he was in partnership with, this gospel that God has confirmed, no matter what happens, he says, all of these adverse circumstances that we're hoping don't happen to anyone else, actually, God used it to advance the gospel. And the gospel is advanced often at great sacrifice. The gospel is advanced often when people pay a tremendous price and suffer injustice and suffer sometimes violence. I was talking to someone recently who has had violence in their life because of preaching the gospel. And it happens in many nations around the world. That's just normal, but yet God uses all types of things to advance the gospel. Then he goes down in verse 16 and speaks once again of the defense of the gospel. And usually when Paul speaks about the defense of the gospel, he's using his intellect, he's using his verbal skills, he's using his reasoning, he's leveraging his relationships and opportunities and his writing. And the defense is a defense against heresies, defense against excesses, defense against confusion, and all these watering down of the gospel. And it's something he did. Typically, God confirms supernaturally, then the preacher is defending it intellectually. And the gospel it advances with both, with supernatural and intellectual. Both are vitally important despite the persecution, despite the adverse situations. So we've got Paul talking about the partnership in the gospel. He's talking about the confirmation of the gospel. He's talking about the defense of the gospel. And he's talking about all of that advances the gospel. And there's two more times that he says something really descriptive of the gospel. In light of all of that, no matter what's happening, he says this in verse 27, only, it's kind of like a conclusion to this thought, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. So whether I come and see you or whether I'm absent, I may hear that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. So he ends these thoughts in chapter 1 about the gospel by talking about and exhorting these people, no matter the price you pay, no matter the circumstances, no matter the opposition, live a life worthy of the gospel. Wow, that's a tall order. It certainly requires deep commitment. It certainly requires great sacrifice. It certainly requires this steadfast drive, but it also deeply requires the grace of God. There's no way any of us can ever even almost live up to the gospel apart from the grace of God, the infilling of the Holy Spirit, the supernatural transformation in our souls and daily empowering every day. And still, it's debatable whether we're living up to it, but that's what Paul's charging them to. In light of all these things I've said about the gospel, live a life worthy of the gospel. I pray that every preacher, every disciple maker, every believer will strive by the grace of God to live a life worthy of the gospel. And then he speaks about striving for the faith of the gospel. And the gospel is always connected to faith. It's not the works of the gospel. It's not the my good deeds of the gospel. It's the faith of the gospel. So leaders, spiritual leaders, let's have a gospel-centered message. Let's trust God to confirm the gospel with signs and wonders. Let's do everything we can to defend the gospel by studying and by thinking and by being reasonable and compelling. Let's see, no matter what's happening, let's advance the gospel to the next neighbor, to the next campus, to the next city, the next nation where it's closed and we can't get in, but the gospel can. Let's live lives worthy of the gospel of Christ.